All right, the next of the code says act independently. Now, as far as act independently, that just means the highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. Your job is not to serve politicians. Your job is not to serve the city council or the mayor or the state's attorney or any attorney. Your job is not even to serve your boss. If your boss, the publisher, says, I don't think we should report that because that's going to hurt our advertising, F your boss. Your job is to act in the best interest of the public. End of story. You work for the public, not for them. They may write your check, they may pay it, but that's only because they're not hiring you to be a writer for them. They're hiring me to be a agent for the public. So let me get this clear. I am paid by them because I am an agent for the public. And as an agent for the public, I write and report and communicate information the public needs and wants. And in return, that brings in advertisers and newspaper sales and other things that the publisher can make money off of. And so he realizes that by keeping me in his employment, he is able to make business opportunities off it. I don't work for my boss, I work for the public, and he pays me because he realizes that that has a value. My service to the public has a value to him, and so he pays me for giving him the opportunity to publish and use what I communicate. Okay? So always keep in mind, you don't work for your publisher, you don't work for your editor, you work for the public. Now, with that said, most editors and most newsrooms have editors who work for the public. And you can't just not listen to them, obviously. And you can't just do whatever you want. But you do realize that, your editor oftentimes has the public's interest. But the job of the newsroom, the job of the journalist should be to serve the public. And they should work for them. Even though they get a paycheck from a publisher, that check is not make them your boss. Your boss is still the public. So as far as acting independently, avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived, disclose unavoidable conflicts. Meaning, the reality is everybody is going to have conflicts of interest. You are covering a murder trial and the lawyer happens to be the lawyer who represented you in divorce, right? Okay, well then maybe you should disclose it. Now in that case, it may not be necessary. But, the newspaper does business with this place or does that. Always make sure that, if at all possible, avoid don't go into business. Don't go out to dinner with people you're covering. If you're covering the city council, you shouldn't go to parties at the mayor's house on your own free time. You can go as a journalist, but don't go as a person. Keep your friends among journalists and among other non-journalists. Non-political players. And if you have a relationship or something comes up where a story involves a friend of yours or involves somebody you go to dinner with or whatever, then you need to tell your editor and you need to ask somebody else to cover the story. Disclose those conflicts. If there's a conflict that can't be avoided, then you need to disclose it. But other than that, try to keep it where you avoid the conflict. That way nobody can come in and say, well, he happens to be friends with this person. Oh, they go out to dinner all the time, so he's not going to give a real story. Oh, well, he's interviewing his father. Like I've known people who are journalists whose parents are, county board chairman, or they're the mayor, or they're a council member. I mean, my dad was on the city council when I was a journalist. Was not in the same town, but my newspaper covered the town that he was in. And so, the reality is that, that had to be something that people were aware of, right? I can tell you, from that. And I always was careful that, I never treated anybody I was related to differently. But I also knew that if I was involved in stories that related to my family, I wouldn't be treated with respect, so I didn't do it. Refuse gifts, favors, fees, free travel, and special treatment. Avoid political and other outside activities that may compromise integrity or impartiality or may damage credibility. So, as far as avoid political activities, that may impact or damage credibility, the reality here is a lot of journalists will not put political signs on their cars, in their yards, anywhere. They won't even, some journalists, in Illinois, you have to declare a political affiliation to vote. Some journalists won't vote in primaries because they refuse to identify as a Republican or Democrat. The reality is you don't want people to say, oh, well, they're only doing it because they're a Republican. They're registered as one. And yes, how you vote in a primary is public record. And so if you vote and you pull a Republican ballot, then people are going to think you're a Republican. If you vote and you pull a Democratic ballot, people will think you're a Democrat. And so that becomes unavoidable. If you go out and you give money to campaigns or you put political signs in your yard, people will assume you are associated. So avoid giving people reason. The other thing is avoid gifts, favors, fees, free travel, special treatment. Don't let people give you anything because you're a journalist. Oh, I love that story you wrote about me. Here, have dinner on me. Or why don't you come over here? Or we have a story coming up. Why don't you fly on my private jet to the place to learn about it? Things like that. I mean, whatever it be, or come on down to this resort so you can learn about it and you can stay for a week. Any of these things are gifts, and they compromise your credibility. They're not giving you things. And journalists, I know journalists, like if I go to a story and there's cookies, I don't take a cookie because I don't want anybody to think, well, that's that. I don't want anybody to think, that I'm just some, journalist who's going to come in and take your cookies. But the other reason is I also don't want people to be like, oh yeah, he's real cozy. He came in there and ate their food and did this and that. I mean, sometimes if I'm going to an event where it's like a special dinner, I might, taste the food. I've been to like a dinner where they're serving Indian food. I'm like, oh, let me try it. I want to try it because that gives me a better perspective on the story. But I don't just go there and take a free meal. It's only if it serves the purpose of the story, not because of that. And I say, like, don't get on the private jet. Like, I knew a guy, a journalist. He worked for the Peoria newspaper, and there was an effort to build a new and improved zoo in Peoria. And so there was a person, and I met the lady, very wealthy lady. I did a story about some of her efforts to raise money, and very nice, and she would give you things, like oh, you should do this or that, very generous, very nice. But part of the thing is I think she was just a nice person, but she also had an agenda, which was to get people to give money and donate so that they would build a new zoo. And so she wanted this journalist to see what the new zoo was going to look like. And so she said, well, we're going to go down and look at a zoo in like Louisiana or Florida or something. And so why don't you guys come on my private plane to Florida and you can see this zoo I want to model our zoo after. And so they said that they would do it. The paper would send a reporter. That way we could get a better image of what the zoo and the plans were and the dream was. They'd get pictures and everything. But they insisted upon the newspaper reimbursing her for the cost of a plane ticket or for the cost of the trip on her private plane. There were going to be several people, but they wanted to at least pay for the seat that the journalist was taking up. Why? Because they didn't want anybody to think that because the person got to ride on a private jet free of charge and the paper wasn't paying for it, that they were going to give them what they wanted. They wanted to remain above board. And that's part of it is it's not just about what actually will influence you, it's about the appearance of influence. And you want to avoid even the appearance of influence. Be wary of sources offering information for favor or money. Do not pay for access news. Identify content provided by outside sources, whether paid or not. So as far as it goes, people sometimes will say, well, I can talk to you, but I'm going to need some money for this. I'm going to need some money for that. Don't ever do it. Now, that sometimes happens in TV where somebody will be like, people will pay for a source to come on the air or do things like that. And that is very unethical. Don't ever pay somebody to do an interview. Okay? And if you get information from outside sources that may have relied upon paid content, make sure you identify it as coming from an outside source. So just make sure that as far as it goes, just make sure you never pay. That is unethical. And you do hear about people saying, well, they were paid by so much to be on Oprah, or they were paid so much to be on this talk show or whatever. Well, you can do that if you're not a journalist. But if you're a journalist, you shouldn't be paying anybody. You should get the information simply because you get the information. And there should never be a promise of payment, because promise of payment brings into question your independence and that person's accuracy and reliability.